By the summer of 1941, Nazi Germany is in near total control of continental Europe. A year earlier, the German blitzkrieg swept through Belgium, the Netherlands and France and forced the British Expeditionary Force to evacuate at Dunkirk. Then, by 1941, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria had all joined the Axis, and Hitler looked further east. Despite a non-aggression pact with Stalin's Soviet Union, Hitler saw his previous success as a blueprint to launch an operation which he thought could bring down the Red Army in a matter of months. Codename Barbarossa. What followed was a brutal, drawn-out strategic defeat, one which was perhaps the beginning of Hitler's downfall. I'm James Hanson, and welcome to History Undone, a history show with a difference where we explore how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Each episode will focus on a different historical battle, but with the help of our experts, we'll examine how split-second decisions at critical junctures tip the balance with dramatic consequences. All you have to do is watch, share and subscribe to History Undone with James Hanson on YouTube. Today, it's Operation Barbarossa, Germany's 1941 plan to invade the Soviet Union, which had dramatic consequences for the Second World War. Hitler famously said, "We only have to kick in the front door and the whole rotten edifice will come tumbling down." Yet, 4 years later, it was he who found himself surrounded in Berlin, not the Russians in Moscow. Joining me today are the author and historian Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry and the historian and former Professor of International History at the University of Glasgow, Mawdsley. Welcome to you both. We have in front of us a huge map of Europe and European Russia. And Chris Parry, to start with you, just talk us through the state of play in the war in the summer of 1941.
Well, I think, as is well known, by the summer of 1941, Nazi Germany is dominating the whole of Europe. Obviously, from Germany and Austria here, it has an ally in fascist Italy here under Mussolini. Spain and Portugal are neutral. France has been neutralised, but Vichy France, the part that isn't controlled by Germany directly, also controls North Africa. We've got a German and Italian army in North Africa that is threatening Egypt under the British. Turkey is neutral in the east. Just before Barbarossa, there's an operation in the Balkans, in Yugoslavia and Greece, and the Germans and some of the Italians managed to take over that part. So the whole continent is dominated by Nazi Germany. They've also got Denmark, they've also got Norway, and they've also got potential allies in the Finns here. Because the Finns, of course, have just fought the famous Winter War against the Soviet Union. Now, what's important is as we approach the middle of 1941, Hitler's very worried economically. He hasn't got access to the raw materials he needs to sustain his war machine. He gets that from Russia. And the Russians are saying, look, you promised us a lot of armaments if you're going to have all this raw materials coming your way. We're giving you oil, we're giving you bauxite to make aluminium, all the sorts of things they need to sustain their war effort. The other thing the Russians have done is they've occupied Bessarabia, which is where roughly Moldova is today, and another place called Buchina, which is where I'm pointing on the map here. It's between essentially Romania, Hungary and what is now Ukraine. And the problem is, when the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed in 1939, there were delineated spheres of influence. And what the Russians have done is actually walked over the line. So Hitler and the Nazis are feeling a bit sort of worried about what Russian intentions are. And there's a historical debate as to whether Stalin was gearing up to actually attack Nazi Germany at some stage in the future. We don't know whether that's true or not, to tell you the truth. But the fact of life is Hitler is thinking about attacking Russia. Why is he doing that? Because he can't reduce Britain. He's not keen on tempting fate by trying to get his army across the channel. The German Navy has been absolutely decimated during the Norwegian campaign and really isn't up for a fight in the Channel and the North Sea. And so what he says is, Britain is really holding out for the Americans to come in the war and maybe the Russians as well. So what we'll do is, we can't take on the Americans at the moment, but what we'll do, we'll go to the east, we'll take Russia out of the war. I want to do that anyway, because I can see the coming conflict between Bolshevism and my own ideological beliefs. Now's a good time. We're dominating the continent. We can solve our economic and also our raw material problems. And right now, my armies are pretty invincible. Everywhere they've gone, they've been successful. Remember, we haven't had the defeat at El Alamein of the German and Italian forces yet. So they're on a real high, and hubris is the #1 characteristic of the German armed forces at this stage.
I have a feeling the word hubris may crop up again as we talk about what happened with Barbarossa. And of course, there's the point about Lebensraum as well, and Germany and Hitler wanting living space for the German people as he would see it. Evan Mawdsley, let's bring you in. Talk me through what Hitler would have considered success with Operation Barbarossa. Where is he trying to get to?
I think the success of Operation Barbarossa has to be seen in both political and military terms, and that it was fundamentally, I think, a political operation, and the objective was to not so much to gain specific territory; it was to destroy the Soviet Union and to eliminate it as a state, so it demanded the campaign kind of it was an overall blow which was going to knock the USSR out of the war and destroy the Soviet government. So it's a very wide aim. It isn't just getting to one particular location. However, in terms of general planning, the view is that they'll get a line which is not quite as far east as you can go on the map, but going from basically the area around Leningrad to the area of the down the Volga, right the way down to Astrakhan, and controlling that area. It's still a considerable distance to this is the overall military plan. It's still some distance from the Urals, but it would have occupied most of European Russia, including a lot of territory east of Moscow.
OK, well, let's zoom in now. Let's look at how Operation Barbarossa played out. Now let's talk about the invasion in two phases. Before us now we have a map of the state of play about a month into Operation Barbarossa, and it's worth mentioning, of course, the German divisions are split up into 3 army groups. We've got North, we've got Centre, and we've got South. Evan Mawdsley, just talk us through the key military figures, the personalities at play here on both sides.
Yeah, it's important to bear in mind that the German High Command is kind of a nested High Command. At the very top, you've got an Armed Forces or Wehrmacht High Command, and then underneath that you have the Army, Navy, and the Luftwaffe high commands. At the head of the Wehrmacht is Hitler as the overall supreme commander, and General Keitel is his chief of staff. General Jodl is the head of the operations department and a key figure in overall planning. Within the army, the OKH is the army headquarters. The army is responsible. Is really the main command in terms of the fighting in the east, and it's under Brauchitsch with General Halder as his chief of staff. Again, key figures in the planning. Beneath that, there are 3 army groups and also 5 Luftwaffe air fleets. The army groups are commanded in the north by von Lieb. The army group in the center is von Bock, and the army group in the south is von Rundstedt. So that's the basic setup on the German side. The Russian side is Slightly more complicated. And in fact, one of the problems the Russians have is they didn't have a clear-cut high command organization before the war began. There wasn't any actual headquarters anywhere. Stalin was notionally in command of the army, but he wasn't the Minister of Defense. He actually had no major role in the army when the war began in June of 1941. And it's only towards the end of the month, the end of June, that an organization called the Stavka is set up in Moscow under Stalin as the key figure. But again, a man with relatively limited military experience and depending on a number of people under him. One of whom is General Zhukov, who is the chief of the general staff in June of 1941. And under this headquarters are 3 or 4 major what are called fronts, or equivalent to German army groups. One in the Baltic, one in the west, and one in the south, in what's now the Ukraine. Russia is a very, very big place, and so the need for these large subcommands is really important.
So Chris Parry, I mean, looking at the situation after a few weeks, as we can see on this map, if you're the Germans, are you happy at this point? Is it going well?
Well, it depends from where you look at it. If you're at the front, you're saying, well, look, I've managed to roll over those bits of the space between Germany, Poland, and also Russia. The bit actually that was occupied by Russia as part of the Ribbentrop-Molotov pact. I've got very deep into Russia here. I've been able to encounter quite a lot of the army groups forward. I've tempted them into essentially an encirclement. I'm taking prisoners. I'm destroying quite a lot of Russian capability in the west. The problem is I'm actually running out of people and also material myself. Why? Because the logistics lines are very weak. The communications into Russia here are very poor, particularly the roads. A lot of them run north-south instead of east-west. The Germans are desperately trying to replace all the railway tracks because there's a different gauge in Russia to the rest of Europe. And in fact, by the end of July, they've replaced 10,000 miles of railway track out of 15,000, which is quite an achievement. But the logistics problems are starting to show. So by this stage, half the panzers need maintenance. Quite a lot of their motorized divisions need maintenance. They've broken down. I think what people forget is the Germans used over 500,000 horses to take their logistics forward as well in this. So it's a very primitive way of doing things. The really important issue is this area here, the Pripyat marshes. They're marshes, they're forests, they're swamps. They're pretty impenetrable, rather like we see in other campaigns. And that really splits the German army groups, and they're unable to support each other across that. And you can see here, look, a big salient behind it where the Russians are. So at the moment, things are going well. Your blitzkrieg tactics, the combination of aviation and panzer groups are actually encircling and annihilating the Russian forces. But your sustainability is starting to suffer here. And the other thing is, you're not really sure what's in front of you. You're getting real indications that the Russians might actually have more people and more material than you thought when you started this. And quite a few of the German generals said before the campaign, have we got this right? And there's an economic assessment as well, which says we think the Russians have got more capability than we think they have, and we need to dwell a pause here. And the person who writes the report, a chap called Georg Thomas, goes to Hitler and says, look, even if we take over everything that you think you're going to get, the Russians still have the capability to come back at us economically and militarily. He goes to see Hitler, comes back and rewrites his report, which says, yeah, it's okay. It shows you the self-delusion that occurs amongst the Germans. This cognitive dissonance throughout this campaign is absolutely marked. If we've got information that contradicts our presuppositions, then we're going to ignore it.
Again, it's that hubris.
Oh yeah, it's definitely hubris. But also look at the scale of the front. You're talking about a huge front here. And this is the biggest military operation in history. And trying to join up all those bits is incredibly difficult. And the other thing that I'm sure Evan will support is that, just like in North Africa, the Germans don't actually put their reserves in to support each army group. And so when they're needed, they're having to traverse huge distances at a time when their logistics aren't up to it. So there's a lot of driving around between the various army groups trying to find penetration points, but actually they're busy doing nothing in some cases and wasting the fuel and the logistics that they've got. We shouldn't underestimate the losses that the Germans too are taking. You know, by the end of July, they've taken 11% casualties, which is pretty significant, even when you consider how many prisoners, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and also the casualties they're inflicting on the Russians at this stage.
Evan, let's bring you in on this. I mean, obviously, famously, Hitler thought this would all be over within a matter of weeks, that you had to kick the door in, the whole thing would come crumbling down. How strong were the Russians in reality?
I think it's right that there's a major underestimation of what's going on. Halder, who was the head of the Army General Staff, kind of noted this in August. He says, in the general situation, what stands out is that we have underestimated the Russian colossus, which has consciously prepared for war with all the effort of a totalitarian state can muster. This assertion applies to general organizational and industrial power, to the communications infrastructure, and above all to the pure military power. At the start of the war, we had counted on about 200 enemy divisions. We have now counted 360. These divisions are not as well armed or equipped as ours. They are often poorly led, but they are there. And if we knock out a dozen of them, then the Russian puts up another dozen. So there is this basic understanding that the situation is much more difficult. Estimating about 220 divisions and actually facing 300 overall was a major misunderstanding. I think above all, and going back to the map that Chris was pointing out, the point to bear in mind about the German plan is that it is a plan to destroy the Red Army in the western borderlands. It isn't a plan to go to Moscow. It isn't a plan to it isn't even a political plan to take over Russia. It's in the short term, what we're going to do is win a massive operational victory, kind of as we did in France, in which we're going to destroy the Red Army. And that's going to be in the western borderlands, west of the Dvina and the Dnieper rivers. They're not very clearly shown on the map, but the Dvina goes from the Gulf of Riga down towards Kiev, and the Dnieper, probably people are more familiar with, goes up around Kiev. But basically, the war is supposed to be won in 6 weeks in the region to the west of those rivers, and that isn't happening. And so what happens what causes it to a halt is the Battle of Smolensk, which is basically late July, early August through September of 1941, when the kind of main spearhead is stopped. So as James has said, this has not been a complete walkover for the Germans in any event, because their losses are considerably higher than they had been in France in 1940. So the German army is suffering severe losses. And part of the reason for this is that it's facing much larger forces, even in the western borderlands, than it had expected. But in addition to that, the Russians are also deploying what's called the second strategic echelon, which is deeper into Russia, behind the Dvina and behind the Dnieper. And that force is coming into play and being thrown forward in the Battle of Smolensk. So the shape of things is much more difficult numerically than the Germans had expected. It's also worth bearing in mind that the German army only began rearming in 1935.
Yes.
The Russian army had been being built up for a longer time, certainly since the early 30s. The Russian army had been developing. We're talking about 1941 now, but the big picture is that Germany is mounting a campaign against an army which is much bigger in terms of personnel and much better equipped than the Germans had expected.
Well, let's fast forward now. Let's move into the winter of 1941, when Operation Barbarossa really does come unstuck. Got another map now. This shows the various German positions between August and December of 1941. Dr. Chris Parry, big question. Where did it all go wrong?
Well, it all goes wrong because the German army very much depends on forward momentum and they get stopped essentially. So Hitler also is actually saying, look, I've got political and economic objectives here, whereas all you guys are trying to do is achieve operational objectives. You know, you're trying to repeat your successes in the West. In the meantime, I've got priorities here. My priorities are Leningrad, the Donbass region of Ukraine here, and thirdly, Moscow. And the German army is saying, look, we need to go for Moscow. You wanted to knock over this organization. We reckon if we get Moscow through Army Group Center, then the war will be over. But Hitler's saying, I've got other priorities here. And he's constantly saying to his commanders, you've got to understand the political economic drivers here. And what happens essentially is after trying to force their way through across a broad front here to take Leningrad, obviously. Why Leningrad? Because there's a lot of armaments factories there. There's a big political association here because Hitler wants to join up with the Finnish army that is in the north here, because he wants to take Archangel, as Evan said earlier, completely neutralize the north. And let's forget that the Finns have got 15 divisions here supporting the Germans, just as the Romanians have 14 divisions as well in the south. So Leningrad's incredibly important to him in knocking out Russian industry and keeping that political and military link going. In the center, as we've seen, the Germans are pushing really hard, but really coming up against it. You have a rainy period that starts in late October, early November. This completely bogs down the panzers and also all the support that's coming up behind, both with the sort of horse-driven wagons, but also the motorized transport as well. And what's really interesting is if you look at the T-34 tank, the one that's coming on stream with the Russians by this stage, they started with about 1,000 T-34s, but they're really producing them at a tremendous pace at this stage. They've got broader tracks, so they can actually survive better than the light tanks, the Panzers, and also the Czech models. They've got quite a lot of Czech tanks on the German side that are floundering a bit here. So they're getting bogged down in these rains. They're hoping when that rainy season ends and the ground actually hardens with the winter, that they can get up and going again. But again, the logistics problems associated with fuel, armaments, and all the other things they need are breaking down. And of course, they haven't prioritized winter clothing and winter sort of equipment. So you've got lube oil that's freezing and things like that. So right here in the center, they're really pretty much stalled. As Evan hinted just now, they've won a huge victory just to the west of Moscow. They've captured hundreds of thousands of Russian troops. Remember in the south that in encircling Kiev, the Germans have captured, they claim, about 660,000 Russian troops. There's probably, historically, we think there's probably about 280,000 in that pocket. So they're being successful operationally, but they're no nearer achieving what Hitler wanted to achieve politically, which was to knock over the Soviet Union as a government, to annihilate all the Russian forces in the western area here, and also to take over the vital industries in both Leningrad and down in the Donbass region here. And we've got to remember also that Moscow is a vital communications hub, in as much as almost all the railways go through there. And of course, the German generals have got their eye on that, so they can bring more stuff forward.
Yeah, and of course, the Battle of Moscow technically goes on until the January of 1942, but Operation Barbarossa officially ended on the 5th of December 1941. Evan, I mean, you know, we've talked about the word hubris already today. To what extent is Hitler just repeating Napoleon's mistake of massively underestimating the Russian winter?
Yeah, I think there's an element of that. I mean, another reason why Hitler isn't very keen on taking Moscow in August of 1941 during the summer was he doesn't want to repeat what Napoleon did. He thinks that was clearly not a great strategy. And there's a big debate in August about whether they should actually push on towards Moscow, which is what the generals want to do, and instead what Hitler makes happen is that the campaign develops in the north against Leningrad and also in the south against Kiev, and there aren't any panzer troops assigned to an offensive against Moscow until September. And as Chris has just mentioned, there is this campaign goes in spurts, and there's another big attempt. I mean, they haven't succeeded in 6 weeks in knocking out the Red Army, but there's another attempt which begins in September called Operation Typhoon, and that begins in October. Another big attempt to encircle the Red Army and destroy it. The goal is to destroy the Red Army in front of Moscow. That actually happens. That army is absolutely shattered in the Battle of what's called Vyazma Bryansk in the area just several hundred miles to the west of Moscow. The problem is, and it's the basic underlying problem of the whole war, is the Russians still have reserves and they're still raising new units, although they've lost extremely high numbers of troops and equipment in the West in the first months of the war. They've also been able to raise a lot of new divisions in central Russia and in Siberia, and those forces are being deployed behind Moscow and preparing for the defense of that city. And in a way, one of the most important decisions made during the whole war is the decision made by Stalin in October of 1941 to hold Moscow. Now that's helped by what Chris has just mentioned, by the autumn thaw, what's called the Rasputitsa, when it becomes very muddy and it's very hard to move things. Bear in mind, by the way, that the Russians rely on rail transport behind Moscow, where the Rasputitsa is not important. The Germans rely on land, road transport west of Moscow, and that's mired down in the mud. So there is a really big logistic factor involved. Above all, however, it's the fact that the Russians still have reserves and they're still bringing them up.
I think the other thing, Evan, which I think is worth mentioning, is the fact that at this stage, Russian arms production is actually exceeding the German arms production, even by this stage, because they're able to move their factories around. They've got east of the Urals as well. And they're bringing forward large amounts of materiel, and particularly armour, which is being produced at a fair lick, and also aviation as well, replacing their losses very quickly. So not just in terms of manpower, the materiel and also industrial capacity of the Russians is being brought to bear on this. And of course, their logistic chains are internalised. They're much shorter. And as Evan said, they've got this rail network behind them, which the Germans can't actually use until they get these railway hubs in Moscow. So very difficult for them. And of course, at this stage, Hitler says, well, OK, I'm going to start concentrating a bit more on these economic objectives. Leningrad's still very important to me. The German generals are saying that we've got to go for Moscow, really have. And it really is an operational success at the expense of strategic failure in the German general's mind. But also Hitler says, let's go for the south. I really want the Donbass region. I need the oil of the Caucasus. I also need quite a lot of the raw materials in Ukraine and the industrial capacity as well. And he sees that he's actually running out of materiel to feed this campaign. But again, let's get back to the point. Look at the space here. It's just huge. I mean, this area we're talking about is 18 times the size of Poland. And of course, if your lens is Poland and France, okay, you're not even seeing this sort of perspective if you're a German general. And part of the problem I think the Germans have, and this is something I always used to teach as a military commander, is the difference between the balcony and the battlefield. There's not enough people getting off the battlefield onto the balcony and say, you know what? I can see we're fighting in the wrong place here. This is not right.
Well, this is the beauty of History Undone. We are on the balcony right now, looking down at what really happened. That's the real history of Operation Barbarossa. Now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. Now we're going to come on to what the long-term historical consequences might have been had Operation Barbarossa either succeeded or indeed never happened at all in the first place. But Evan Mawdsley, first of all, I just want to get your thoughts as to whether Operation Barbarossa could have played out differently and what it could have looked like had it played out differently. I mean, for instance, what happened at Moscow? Just talk us through that.
Well, Moscow is kind of the logical result of the Barbarossa plan. It's when things totally become unstuck. And I would argue that the Battle of Moscow is the most important battle of the Second World War because it's the point at which the fallacy of the whole Barbarossa plan becomes very clear. They run out of time, they run out of resources, and they are outfought when it comes to the Battle of Moscow. Moscow is primarily there's a big decision about, do we go on to Moscow? This is in November. Do we go on to Moscow, or do we stop? Do we create a kind of defensible line and then defend that and hope to fight, open the campaign again in the spring of 1942. They decide to go for Moscow. Again, I think hubris, as Chris has said, is a major element in all that. They don't believe that the Red Army is capable of mounting a counteroffensive in early December 41 because it's been so badly knocked about in Operation Typhoon, and they have not been able to factor in, because they're not aware of it, of the strength of Soviet reinforcement in the autumn of 1941, raising new forces. And the Russians now have a first-rate commander in the forces defending Moscow in the form of General Zhukov, who is the overall commander of the Western Army Group. And Zhukov puts together a plan to counterattack. Stalin thinks about it for a long time and then says, okay, we go ahead, even though it's very risky, because it involves, if Moscow goes, then it's very hard to hold on behind Moscow. They go ahead, the counterattack takes place. The German forces are exhausted by that time. They're fighting around Moscow. The weather's beginning to change. And then, as you can see in the map, in particular in the lower left-hand corner of the map, there's a big pocket in which the German armies are in place in front of Moscow, and to the north and to the south there are these forces moving forward, but they are about to come under attack from a massive Soviet counterattack, which is not expected. And within a matter of 3 or 4 days, the army in front of Moscow is forced to go back into retreat. In a matter of about 1 or 2 weeks, it appears that the whole front of the German army in Russia may be about to collapse, with a disaster like Napoleon faced in 1812.
Well, let me throw in a what if for you, Chris Parry, as to how the Battle of, well, not necessarily the Battle of Moscow, but Operation Barbarossa generally might have played out differently. Let's say Hitler ignores Moscow. You don't go for Moscow. You just go for the Caucasus because that's where the oil is. Would that have worked?
It depends on timing and also the amount of troops you can get there. I think the really interesting point here is that right up until Barbarossa, other voices were saying there's another way to do this. For example, the head of the German Navy, Admiral Raeder, was saying, look, this is a fool's errand, and the Navy is the biggest opponent. And everybody says, oh, it's just the Navy being like that. But he says, look, if Rommel and the Italians push through to the Suez Canal, we can come up through the Caucasus this way. We don't actually have to confront these huge, massive forces that we know are there. They're not very good, of course, you're saying that, but actually we could come this way. Much better idea. And Raeder says this right up till the start of the campaign. He continues with this and said, look, we'll run the British out of the Mediterranean and we'll concentrate on this. What's really interesting is, even as this is taking place, just before the collapse, the German army and also Hitler are thinking about what they're going to do afterwards. So we're going to basically stabilize here and maybe turn west, but also actually we might actually go further east once we've got the Caucasus. So they're still full of big, unrealizable ideas. And of course, in 1942, they go down to the south here. And that ends up, of course, with Stalingrad. It also ends up with the potential for German troops being trapped down here in the Caucasus as well. Von Manstein tries to relieve Stalingrad, could also get caught himself by the encircling Russian armies. And by then, of course, it's all over. Stand by for the Battle of Kursk. And then the front generally collapses after that. So what people are trying to do is salvage something out of this. So Hitler's saying, let's do this drive to the south. Let's get the resources. Let's knock out Leningrad, consolidate our link to Finland, control the Baltic and the Black Sea, because we know the Russians are uniquely sensitive about losing control of the Baltic and the Black Sea. So that's what they're trying to salvage while holding the centre here. Would it have been successful? No, they're running out of steam. They're running out of supplies. They're running out of manpower. Quite extraordinary levels of losses have occurred here. And Army Group Centre in particular is under tremendous pressure. The Russians are trying to drive in between the gaps between Army Group North, Army Group South and Army Group Centre. So the sheer pressure of numbers is starting to tell here now.
Evan, what if Operation Barbarossa had started a month earlier, as I think originally planned? I mean, does that mean that you don't face the severity of the Russian winter until that much later into the operation? Does that make any difference, or is that really very marginal?
I think it might have made some difference. I think the problem is partly a question of mobilizing and moving troops, and that's slow anyway. So that would have been, I think, it would have been ambitious even without the Balkan campaign to build up enough German troops in the front facing Russia. But I think the basic problem and the fundamental problem is that, and I think Chris has kind of alluded to that, is there is no way that the Germans can win a war of attrition in Russia against a much larger enemy with a considerable arms manufacturing capability, with a huge territory with pure communications. That's just not possible. The only way you can knock Russia out of the war is by a quick operational victory. And to that extent, I can kind of understand where even the Army High Command are coming from. You know, if we can win this blitzkrieg offensive in the west of Russia, if we can actually knock the Red Army out, then the government will collapse and things will be kind of straightforward, just as they were in 1917, and sort of, I think, in a way, as they were in France in 1940. You know, it will have this effect. But I think they know, and almost everyone knows, that there's no way in which they can win a prolonged campaign, because once the British are still fighting. They're evidently more dangerous in North Africa in November, December 1941 than they had been before. There's actually a real threat of the Italian army is now getting thumped in North Africa, and there's every possibility that the United States will enter the war. So there's kind of only a window of opportunity in Russia, and by the time you get to the end of 1941, that window has closed. My own personal view is there's almost no chance of Operation Barbarossa succeeding or the war against Russia succeeding.
Well, Chris, you used a great phrase earlier on. You said sometimes people need to stand on the balcony as opposed to being on the battlefield. So let's do that now, and let's ask ourselves a really big question. What would the world look like now? How might things have been different had Operation Barbarossa either succeeded or not happened at all? Well, we've returned to the big map of Europe and European Russia now. We're going to ask ourselves some really big questions about what the long-term historical consequences would have been had Operation Barbarossa played out differently. Chris Parry, to start with you on this. I suppose one thing we should consider, what if Operation Barbarossa never happened? Yeah,
it's an interesting point. I think if Barbarossa hadn't happened, the Germans would have permanently thought about the thought of the Russians actually building up their military strength, actually encroaching into the Baltic and the Black Sea regions even more into German sphere of influence, and possibly attacking them at some stage 2 years later. And there's evidence to suggest that Stalin was actually thinking about that as well. So that's a distinct possibility that they would have had this thought in their back. What certainly would have happened, I think, is that the Germans would have said, look, we've got to take out Great Britain.
Yeah.
If we don't bring it to terms, or we don't actually invade, it's always going to be a problem. It's going to be a 700-mile long aircraft carrier in case the Americans want to get involved. And at some stage we may have to take on the Americans, so we can't have that sitting there alone like that. I think we've got to believe what the Germans said they would do. They would run us out of the Mediterranean. That's the first thing. They would take Malta and Gibraltar. That's what they said they would do. They would probably try and get Turkey involved in the war at some stage so that they can penetrate into Iran and the Middle East. They're hoping that Rommel and everybody is going to come around from the south through Syria and Palestine. And Hitler is openly talking about driving into India from Afghanistan and Iran, even while this is going on. The big mistake, of course, which everybody missed, is just as the Battle of Moscow is being won by the Russians, of course, there's Pearl Harbor.
Yes,
and
indeed.
4 days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler declares war on the United States. so if you haven't got enough problems here, okay, let's take on the United States now. We're going to have to do it one day, so let's do it now. And we are being loyal to Japan and Italy in that sense.
Well, Pearl Harbor's a massive what if, and obviously we're going to talk about that very soon, actually, on History Undone, so stay tuned for that episode. We've got a dedicated episode all about Pearl Harbor. I suppose almost what you're saying, Chris, is that Hitler was always bound to invade somewhere. He's like a shark. He's always got to move forward. If it's not Russia, he'd go for the UK or he'd go for North Africa.
You've got to bear in mind that by this stage, Germany has become a heavily militarised society. Right at the core of their national identity is this old Prussian warfare sort of ethos that they've got. And unless they keep expanding, they're going to contract. They also need the resources. So they're going to have to come to terms with the Russians somehow and say, look, while we're holding you at length, we do want your resources. And Hitler famously said, if we can't maintain access to those resources, we're going to take them. So it may have happened later on rather than at the time. But right now, I think the Germans will consolidate in Europe here. They're still pushing for Lebensraum in the east here. There's no question about that. And at some stage, the Germans would have had to expand east to get the resources, both in terms of land, but agricultural land, but also in terms of raw materials and things like that.
Well, let's talk about another big what if, Evan. What if Operation Barbarossa does succeed? And however you define that is quite interesting, but we touched in the beginning that Hitler wanted to essentially crush the Soviet Union. So let's say that happens. What are the consequences? What does that mean for the rest of the war?
So I think if the overall objectives of Operation Barbarossa had succeeded, and I think that's unlikely to have happened, but it could have happened. For other reasons, the Soviet Union could have collapsed. But in any event, if Russia was no longer in the war, if most of European Russia was occupied by the Germans, then it would have all kinds of major consequences. It would have, there would no longer be any supply problems for the Third Reich. It would have had adequate supplies of both minerals, but also in particular of grain. It would have food resources to survive for a very long time. Britain would be knocked out of the war. The whole point of the campaign, in some respects, had been to convince the British government that there was no way in which it could keep fighting once Russia had been knocked out of the war. Once Russia goes, I think it would be reasonable to expect either some change of British policy, a removal of the Churchill government, and finding a government that would come to some kind of terms with Hitler, like Vichy France, or in which Britain was actually invaded. It was impossible to invade Britain in 1940, or to have a successful air campaign against Britain in 1940 or 1941. That would have been possible in 1942, I think. So it would have been hard for Britain to survive. If Britain doesn't survive as an anti-German entity, then I can't see any way in which a counteroffensive could have been launched at a strategic level against Nazi Germany by the United States or anybody else. So I think the consequences of the collapse of the Soviet Union would have been enormous in historical terms.
Chris Parry, what are the Russians doing? I mean, we say in this scenario that the Soviet Union has essentially collapsed, but there must be some form of Russian government. What, they retreat into the Urals?
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the line that Germans postulated, Archangel here through to Astrakhan, so you're losing quite a lot of your population here. And part of the German plan was to annihilate 30 million Russians to make sure that the food supplies were adequate for them in the initial stages. So what has happened, though, is quite a lot of the industry has been taken back behind the Urals. I think quite a lot of the population there would have been mobilized. And we've got to remember that beyond the Urals, there's quite a substantial state that can exist. And for the Germans to extend that all that way before they've consolidated this huge fortress Europe that they would be able to set up, and Evan's right, if you've got access to all the resources you need, you're in an autarkic situation. You're self-contained here. You don't have to worry about all the things that crush the Germans and their allies in World War I. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the capacity of the Russians to basically rehabilitate, to restore capability behind the Urals, and at some stage come back very hard with their material and their manpower to retake some of this. It's not important to think the Russians might have won that, but to think that it's a constant sore that the Germans are having to deal with. So you've got this huge pressure from the east coming on. You've got to commit lots of resources to defending and holding down this area. And I think that would have been a continued sort of drain on German resources at some stage. So we've got to think about that. I think the other thing one has to bear in mind is what Japan would have done.
Yeah. Do they suddenly think, hang on a minute, we've got a weakened Russia, we'll attack it from the east?
Well, I think the key thing for Japan is it gives them a free hand in China and also in Southeast Asia as well. If they haven't got a threat from Russia or Russia is vulnerable, then the Japanese can get on with what they want to do in Manchuria. And I think that's the important factor there. We mentioned earlier, of course, that December 1941 coincides with the attack on Pearl Harbor. Again, how does Russia sitting behind the Urals or even in the west here, up to Gorky or something like that, how does that affect it? Well, it does affect it because the United States is actually supplying quite a lot of material to Russia as well, going in through Vladivostok. How do the Japanese see that at that stage? Because the Japanese let Russian ships go all the way into Vladivostok throughout the Second World War because they weren't at war with them. And so Russian ships taking American material were absolutely unhindered in the east. So there's the ability to actually supply them. But the loss of the Arctic convoys, the possible threat to Iran, meaning we can't actually take supplies in from America and Britain into Russia, makes it very difficult indeed. But I wouldn't underestimate the ability of Asiatic Russia to come back and be a real problem here in the east.
Evan, Operation Barbarossa is famously often cited as a real turning point in the Second World War. So had it gone differently, had it been a success for the Germans, are we saying that Nazi Germany wins the Second World War? Are we going that far?
I think possibly you could. I mean, I think that, just going back a second to Chris's point, the parallel that I would see with, behind the Urals is kind of like China in 1940-41, yep. After, 1939-40, when in fact China does give up the whole coastal area, most of eastern China, and falls back in effect to behind the Urals to Chongqing, and it really plays only a minor role in the rest of the war. I mean, the Japanese have a field army in China, but they're never under that great pressure. But to answer your question directly, I think probably it would have made the Second World War very different. I think America would have had to fall back on what they call hemispheric defense, but I can see it would be very difficult for the Americans to restore the position in Europe. I think the position in the Far East is a bit different, but even then, I don't think there's. I mean, I think the British Empire might have survived. The Canada, Australia, New Zealand. I think that they might have survived as an entity fighting with the United States. But I really can't see I would think the European war would come to an end when Russia is knocked out of it, if it is knocked out of it by the German armies.
That's really fascinating.
Hitler's logic is right. If I knock out Russia, Britain's really in a desperate position. So he's absolutely right. And if they're able to consolidate here and get all the resources that are available, the population, all the sort of Nazi ideology and the racial ideology as well, you've got a Germanic domination here for probably decades.
Obviously, what happened after the Second World War, Chris, was the Cold War with the Soviet Union, because it emerged so powerfully from the Second World War. But the Cold War doesn't happen, therefore, under this scenario.
Well, it's quite interesting because if you say Barbarossa doesn't happen, and let's say Stalin does attack Germany in, say, 1943 and 1944, what happened at the end of the Second World War is a real possibility. Because if they actually knock Germany out, they don't stop till they get to the Atlantic.
They're even more powerful.
Yeah. So if Germany doesn't attack the Soviet Union. There's a good chance that later on, when it really became powerful, got all its armaments going, took on Germany, actually did what it did in 43, 44, and just keeps driving west. And of course, what stopped them? Two things. One was obviously a massive American conventional power, but also the fact that we had a nuclear device. So again, there's a road to go down there. At what stage do you say, look at this vast German entity here, we need something bigger and better than conventional forces to deter it in the first place and defeat it secondly?
So the Cold War would have been a Cold War between the US and Nazi Germany?
Well, no, I think it would have been a Cold War, I think, if things had rolled out between the US, Canada, if you like, the British Empire, but maybe not Britain, and also a massive Soviet thrust into Western Europe if they brushed aside. So what I'm saying to you is, if Barbarossa hadn't happened, a reverse Barbarossa probably would have done about 3 years afterwards, because the Russians would have rolled west.
Yeah.
Yeah, come in.
Well, the other thing, just to throw something in totally off the wall, is that I know that when you were talking about Battle of Midway in an excellent program you did that I saw last week, the atomic bomb was brought in as a factor which kind of would have squared the odds. Yeah, I kind of think that, okay, you know, America does begin to develop, and Britain begins to develop a nuclear weapon in 1940-41, and that makes a big difference in 1945. But what if Nazi Germany had also developed a nuclear weapon, and you had a Cold War which was like the actual Cold War, where nuclear weapons make many kinds of military operations impossible? That also, I think, is a what if. Which would be interesting in this situation, which Chris is talking about the post-war world. I think it's the one where we're talking about. For me, it's the one where Germany controls all of Europe and the UK, and in that situation, I don't see how, with conventional means, Germany is going to lose that position. I think I think it must be so strong that it would have been hard to push back.
Well, this is absolutely fascinating. We're saying that had Operation Barbarossa played out differently, the long-term consequences could have been enormous. The Churchill government goes in the UK. A new form of Operation Sea Lion to invade Britain may have succeeded. Potentially, you have Nazi Germany dominating all of Europe. If it doesn't happen, if Operation Barbarossa never happened, maybe it's the Soviets who dominate mainland Europe. Potentially, Japan is emboldened to push into China. What are the Americans up to? Do they focus on the Pacific and never get involved in the war in Europe? There are some massive long-term consequences that all stem from Operation Barbarossa. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. Huge thanks to Evan Mawdsley and Dr. Chris Parry for joining me. We will be back undoing more battles from history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Undone with James Hanson on YouTube. And you can also catch me presenting Frontline on Times Radio. That's it from us. Goodbye.